Almost everything you've been taught about waiting may be backwards. You were told that patience is passive, that it means doing nothing, feeling nothing, simply enduring until something finally changes. But what if impatience has been costing you something this entire time, and you never realized what it was costing you? Not a bill in your mailbox, not a charge on your bank statement, something far quieter, something that slowly takes your peace, your clarity, your confidence, one small decision at a time. You don't just wait longer, you start paying for it. The greatest cost of impatience is almost never the delay. It's who you become while trying to outrun time. Florence Scovel Shinn understood this long before modern psychology began describing what chronic urgency does to the human mind, and the principle behind it may explain why so many sincere people unknowingly delay the very thing they're trying to receive. There is a moment nearly everyone reaches, sooner or later. You have prayed, you have believed, you have done the quiet inner work no one else can see, and still, the thing you were waiting for has not arrived. So you do what feels reasonable. You push a little harder. You check a little more often. You make a decision you wouldn't have made in a calmer week, simply because waiting has started to feel unbearable. It rarely feels like a mistake in the moment. It feels like taking control back. And this is where the story usually gets told wrong, because most people believe that impatience has one cost, paid once, a rushed decision, a bad week, a conversation you regret. A single, forgivable moment. But that isn't how it works. Impatience doesn't send one bill. It opens an account. Every shortcut has a hidden invoice. Somewhere, quietly, the first entry is made. Not one you can see, not one anyone hands you. There is no envelope on your counter, no notification on your phone, and yet, from the very first moment you tried to force something that wasn't ready, something was recorded. Impatience always offers immediate relief. It simply delays the payment. Here is the part almost no one is told. It stays open. And every time impatience makes another decision on your behalf, a slightly wrong turn, a slightly early exit, a slightly too quick yes, another line is added, small ones at first, barely worth noticing, a project abandoned 2 weeks before it would have worked. A door closed simply because it hadn't opened fast enough. A version of yourself, calmer and steadier, quietly traded for a version who could no longer stand to wait. None of these feel like payments. That's what makes them dangerous. You don't experience them as a cost. You experience them as just what happened, as bad luck, as a phase, as the way things go. But Florence Scovel Shinn would have asked a different question. Not what happened to you, but what did you do in the moment you couldn't wait, that you wouldn't have done in the moment you trusted? That question changes everything because it moves the story out of circumstance and into choice. Impatience always feels free in the moment. The invoice arrives later. Somewhere in you there may already be a version of this story. A moment you can almost remember. Not a disaster, nothing dramatic, just a small decision made in a hurry, made because waiting had simply become too loud to sit inside. That decision didn't disappear. The account is still open. Today, for the first time, we're going to read what's written inside it. Here is the belief almost every sincere person carries, usually without ever saying it out loud. If nothing is happening, I need to do more. It doesn't arrive as a thought you examine. It arrives as an instinct, the same instinct that makes you check a door twice or refresh a page that hasn't changed. Stillness starts to feel like danger. Waiting starts to feel like falling behind. So you respond the only way that feels safe. You add effort. You add urgency. You add a decision that wasn't asked for simply because doing nothing had become unbearable. This belief has a certain logic to it. If you did something to cause the good you're waiting for, a prayer, a decision, a change of heart, then surely more of that same thing will bring it faster. Twice the effort, twice the speed. It sounds almost mathematical, but manifestation was never a machine that runs faster the harder you push its pedal. Florence Scovel Shinn taught something that quietly contradicts this entire belief. She taught that the moment you have to force a thing, you have already stepped outside the very law that was going to bring it to you, not because effort is wrong. Because this particular kind of effort, the kind born of nothing is happening so I must do more, doesn't come from faith. It comes from its opposite. It comes from the fear that you have been forgotten. And that fear cannot build the thing it's trying to build because it is made of the exact material the outcome requires you to release. Here is the part that makes this belief so difficult to catch. It never announces itself as fear. It disguises itself as responsibility, as initiative, as finally taking action after too much passive waiting. Fear rarely asks for permission. It simply sends another invoice. A woman waiting for a slow season in her business to turn will tell herself she is being proactive when she drops her prices in panic 3 days before a client was already about to say yes. A man waiting for a difficult conversation to resolve itself will tell himself he is taking control when he sends the message that damages the very trust he was hoping to repair. In both cases, something was already moving, quietly, beneath what could be seen, and in both cases, the belief, if nothing is happening, I need to do more, reached in and interrupted it. This is the first entry Impatience makes on the account we opened a moment ago, not the decision itself. The belief underneath it, the quiet conviction that stillness equals absence, that waiting equals nothing, that a divine order working outside of your sight must not be working at all. Florence would have said the opposite is true. That in the interval between the prayer and its answer, something is always happening, bringing together people, opportunities, timing, and circumstances beyond your present view. The season is not empty. It is accumulating value you cannot yet measure. If nothing is happening, I need to do more is not a harmless assumption. It is the exact belief that convinces a woman to abandon a manifestation 3 weeks before it would have arrived. It is the belief that makes someone change direction for the 4th time this year, always one season short of the very thing that was forming underground. Every rushed decision made from this belief adds another line to the account. And what makes it especially costly is this: the moment you act from I need to do more, you stop cooperating with the very order you were praying to align with. You don't accelerate the harvest. You simply increase the cost of reaching it. Urgency is often fear wearing the mask of responsibility. Faith waits differently. Because what if the problem was never that you were waiting? What if the problem was the way you were waiting? Faith waits differently. That single distinction may be the most important thing you hear today. So let's slow down and actually look at it. There are 2 ways to wait for something you want. From the outside, they can look almost identical. The same silence, the same unanswered question, the same ordinary Tuesday with nothing visibly different about it. But on the inside, they are opposites. One way of waiting is built on absence. You wait because nothing has happened yet, and every day that passes without change feels like evidence that it may never come. This kind of waiting is exhausting because it is really just fear, stretched out over time and disguised as patience. The other way of waiting is built on trust. You wait because something is already in motion, even though you cannot yet see it. The way a woman 8 months along doesn't pace the room in panic, wondering if anything is happening inside her. She rests a hand on what's already forming. She doesn't need proof. The waiting itself is the evidence. Florence Scovel Shinn spent much of her work circling this exact difference, though she rarely gave it one single name. She wrote of impressing the subconscious and then releasing the outcome to what she called divine order, of asking, believing, and then, crucially, ceasing to labor. Not ceasing to expect. Ceasing to strain. It's the principle we'll call for today the law of unforced timing. Here is what it teaches, put simply. Everything you are trying to manifest has an appointed season, and anxiety does not make that season arrive sooner. It only changes your relationship to the time in between. Read that again, because it corrects a mistake almost everyone makes without noticing. We tend to believe that if something hasn't shown up yet, the problem must be in the waiting. So we try to fix the waiting by doing more, checking more, forcing a door that hasn't opened. But the law of unforced timing says the problem was never the waiting itself. The problem is what we do to the waiting when we can't stand to be inside it. This is where the account we opened earlier becomes impossible to ignore. Every rushed decision is an early withdrawal from a future that hadn't finished growing. Not as punishment. As consequence, the same way a seed pulled from the soil to check on it doesn't get punished for the disturbance, it simply stops becoming what it was already on its way to becoming. Faith, by contrast, makes no withdrawals. It leaves the account alone and lets what's forming keep forming. This doesn't mean faith is passive. Florence never taught passivity. She taught aligned action, the decree spoken with conviction, the vision held steady, the next right step taken calmly. What she consistently warned against was a different kind of movement entirely, movement that comes from "I don't trust this is working, so I will make something happen myself." That single sentence, quiet, barely conscious, rarely spoken aloud, is the real cost, not the decision that follows it. The belief underneath. Because once you believe nothing is happening, every decision that follows will be built on that lie, and lies are expensive to build on. Faith is not waiting for something to begin. Faith is refusing to interrupt what has already begun. The law of unforced timing doesn't ask you to feel nothing while you wait. It asks you to notice the difference between two kinds of stillness. The stillness of fear, pretending to be calm, and the stillness of trust that has simply stopped interrupting. One of them keeps the account closed. The other keeps opening new lines on it, one hurried decision at a time. And the difference between them is rarely dramatic. It's rarely loud. Most of the time it looks like nothing at all. By then, most people think life failed them. They never realized they had been paying the bill themselves. Before we go further, there is something small I want to invite you to do. Not a comment about what happened to you, not a story to explain, just 5 words if you're ready for them. Somewhere in this video, you may have recognized a decision you made, quietly, out of impatience, out of fear disguised as urgency. Maybe you've never once thought of it as a cost. Maybe today is the first time you saw it that way. You don't need to describe it below. You don't need to relive it. That part is already behind you. What matters now is what you decide about it today. One idea that runs throughout Florence Scovel Shinn's work is that the words we consistently speak or write shape the direction of our inner life. Naming something as finished is often the first step toward finally releasing it. Not because the words are magic, but because they help bring the mind into agreement with a new decision. So if you're ready to stop paying the hidden cost of impatience, if you're ready to let this be the moment that particular account stops growing, comment these exact words below. This account is closed. Nothing more is required. No explanation, no story, just one decision. From this moment forward, let the account stay closed. Because once an account is closed, no new charges can be added, and that's exactly what we're about to talk about. An account that's been closed stays closed only as long as no new charges are made against it. And this is where most people, without realizing it, quietly reopen theirs. Not through one dramatic decision. Through 100 small ones, each so minor it barely registers as a choice at all. Here is the discovery this part of the story actually holds. The most expensive decisions are almost never the dramatic ones. Your future is rarely changed by one great mistake. It's shaped by something quieter. Repeated small discounts on your own trust, compounding in a direction you never chose on purpose. Consider a woman named, well, it doesn't matter what her name is. You may already know her. She might be you some Tuesday 2 years ago. She had built something slowly, a small business, a creative practice, a relationship, a plan. It doesn't matter which. What matters is the season it was in. Quiet, unremarkable, the kind of season where nothing visible happens for weeks at a time, and everything worth having is happening exactly where no one can see it. 3 weeks before it would have turned a corner, she made a decision. Not a bad person's decision. A tired person's decision, an anxious person's decision, made by someone who had simply run out of the ability to sit inside, not yet. She lowered a price that didn't need lowering. She sent a message that couldn't be unsent. She said yes to something smaller because the larger thing hadn't arrived on schedule, and waiting had become the loudest sound in the room. She never realized none of those decisions came from the woman who had started the journey. They came from the woman who had grown tired of waiting. Fear rarely walks in labeled as fear. It walks in wearing the clothes of good sense. I'm just being realistic. I'm just moving on. I'm just protecting myself. Every one of those sentences can be true and still be the moment a charge gets added. Here's what makes this so easy to miss. One withdrawal doesn't empty an account. It's rarely even a large amount. That's exactly why it doesn't feel dangerous. But the real danger was never the first withdrawal, it was the interest that followed. Fear has a habit of charging you twice. First, when it convinces you to act too soon, then again when that decision becomes evidence for the next one. Because a rushed decision doesn't just cost you an opportunity, it teaches your mind something. It says quietly, see, waiting doesn't work, so you were right to rush. And a mind that has been taught that lesson once will reach for it again, faster the second time, faster still the third. A second door gets closed early. A second plan gets abandoned in month 2 instead of month 6. A second relationship gets ended by text instead of given the season it needed to either heal or honestly end. Fear never asks for the full payment up front. It prefers installments, a little more trust, a little more peace, each time slightly easier to give away than the last. None of these moments look connected to each other. They feel like separate stories. Bad luck here, a difficult year there, a series of things that just happen to go wrong. They are not separate, they are entries on the same account. This is the part Florence Scovel Shinn's teaching quietly insists on, even though she never used this exact language. The mind doesn't experience these moments as unrelated accidents. It experiences them as evidence, and evidence once collected starts writing a story. Things don't work out for me. I always jump too soon. Every time I trust, I get burned. That story isn't true. But every hurried decision keeps adding to its balance. Faith doesn't panic sell. Fear does, and fear is expensive precisely because it never charges once. It compounds quietly in the space between one hurried decision and the belief it leaves behind, and by the time that belief has repeated itself a dozen times, it no longer feels like a belief at all. It feels like a fact about who you are. That's the real cost we're about to look at next, not the sum of the decisions, but who you'd become while making them. Here is the part of this account almost no one thinks to check. For most of this video, we've been talking as though the thing being spent was opportunity, a door, a season, a result that came later, or smaller, or not at all. But that was never the real balance. The real balance was you. Every rush to decision doesn't just cost you a door or a season. It makes a small, quiet deposit into who you understand yourself to be. And unlike money, this kind of balance doesn't sit still, waiting to be spent later. It compounds into identity, and identity, once formed, starts making your decisions for you before you've even had a chance to think. This is worth slowing down for because it's the layer underneath everything we've said so far. The first time you rush a decision out of fear, you tell yourself a story. This was necessary. This was realistic. This was just what the situation called for, and it may even have felt that way. But somewhere underneath that story, a quieter one is also being written. I am someone who can't wait. I am someone who has to control things to feel safe. I am someone for whom waiting has never worked. That second story doesn't announce itself. It simply accumulates the way sediment accumulates at the bottom of still water, invisible for a long time, and then one day, the entire floor of the riverbed. And here is what makes it so costly. Once that identity has formed, you stop making decisions from a place of, what does faith require right now? You start making them from, what would someone like me do? And someone like that rushes. Someone like that doesn't trust silence. Someone like that reaches for the nearest form of control the moment things go quiet. This is why impatience so rarely stays a single event. It isn't just repeating a behavior, it's confirming an identity, and the identity, once confirmed, asks to be confirmed again. Florence Scovel Shinn understood something that modern language would call self-concept, though she never used that word. She taught that our outer experiences often reflect the inner assumptions we continue to accept about ourselves, and every rushed decision is a small vote cast for a version of yourself that doesn't trust the process it claims to believe in. This is also why simply trying to be more patient so rarely works on its own. Patience isn't a discipline you apply on top of an identity that still believes waiting is dangerous. It's what naturally happens once that underlying belief has actually changed. You cannot out-discipline a belief. You can only replace it. So the real cost of impatience was never only the missed door, the lowered price, the message sent too soon. Those were only ever the visible charges, the ones that show up on the statement, easy to point to, easy to regret. The real charge was quieter, and it was this: every time you rushed, you practiced being someone who doesn't trust, and practice, whether you intend it or not, always produces a result. It produces someone fluent in urgency and increasingly unfamiliar with rest. Here is the reversal Florence's teaching offers, and it is the whole hinge of everything we've covered today. If identity compounds in one direction through fear, it can also compound in the other direction through trust. Every time you choose to remain instead of force, you make a different kind of deposit, not toward a future event, but toward a version of yourself who has practiced believing that what's forming doesn't need to be rescued. That version of you doesn't need proof today. She has made this deposit enough times to no longer require it. This is not something you arrive at by deciding it once, today, and never revisiting it again. It's something you practice the way you'd practice anything worth becoming fluent in, which is exactly what we're about to walk through together. Everything we've talked about today has been circling toward this moment, so let's actually do it together. If fear compounds through rushed decisions, then trust compounds the same way, through small, repeated deposits of a very different kind, not extraordinary ones. Not a single dramatic leap of faith. Just small, ordinary moments where you choose to remain instead of force, practiced often enough that they start to outweigh everything fear has been quietly withdrawing. We're going to call this the trust deposit practice, and it works exactly the way it sounds. Each day you make one small deposit, not toward a specific outcome, but toward the version of you who no longer needs to rush. Here's exactly how it works, and I want to walk you through it slowly, because the value of this practice is in how ordinary it feels, not in how dramatic it seems. Think of one thing right now. One thing you have been waiting on. It doesn't need to be the biggest thing in your life. It can be small. A reply that hasn't come, a season in your work that hasn't turned yet, a quiet hope you've almost stopped saying out loud. From now on, every time you feel the urge to rush it, this is what you do. When you check your account and the number hasn't changed the way you hoped, when you pay a bill and some old fear tries to whisper that there isn't enough, when you're waiting for an answer and your mind starts asking, what else do I need to do? Pause. And instead of reaching for the old shortcut, say this, quietly or out loud, whichever feels more honest. What is meant for me does not need to be forced. You are not denying reality when you say this. You are not avoiding action or pretending a problem isn't real. You are simply refusing, in that one moment, to make a decision from fear instead of from trust. There's a second line that belongs with the first, and together they form the whole practice. I don't need to know when. I don't need to know how. I trust that divine order is already working in my favor. That's it. That's the entire practice. I want to be honest with you about something, because Florence's teaching was never about pretending difficulty away. This will likely feel uncomfortable the first several times you try it. The old instinct, do more, check again, force it, doesn't disappear just because you've decided once to do something different. It will very likely show up again tomorrow, insisting that today is finally the day you need to act out of urgency instead of trust. When that happens, you are not failing the practice. You are exactly at the point where the practice does its work. Notice the urgency, let it be there, and make the deposit anyway. Some days you may not feel any different right after you say it. That's expected, and it doesn't mean nothing happened. Deposits rarely feel like anything the day they're made. Over time, your mind begins to recognize this new pattern of trust as familiar, the same way it once learned the pattern of urgency. Do this once today, then again tomorrow. You don't need a perfect streak of deposits to begin changing the balance. You only need to stop making withdrawals long enough for what was already accumulating underneath the fear to finally become visible. This is the version of doing something that actually cooperates with the law of unforced timing instead of working against it. Action taken not to force an outcome, but to become one unhurried decision at a time, the kind of person who can finally receive what was already being prepared. There is a question almost everyone waiting for something eventually asks, usually somewhere around the third or fourth month of silence. Where is the proof this is actually working? We tend to look for that proof in exactly one place, outside. A number that finally moves, a door that finally opens. Some external sign, arriving on schedule, confirming that all of this was real and not simply something we talked ourselves into, and when that external proof doesn't arrive on the timeline we quietly expected, we draw the only conclusion that seems to make sense: nothing is happening. But that conclusion was never accurate. It was only ever a measurement problem, looking for the deposit in the one place it doesn't first appear. Because the first place trust ever shows up isn't in your circumstances. It's in you. Think back to the version of you who opened this video. She was checking things twice. She was one disappointing week away from a decision made in a hurry. Silence felt to her indistinguishable from absence. If she couldn't see it, she assumed it wasn't there. If even one trust deposit has landed differently today than it would have a week ago, if you've noticed even a small, quiet loosening around something you've been gripping, that is not nothing. That is the first proof. It simply isn't the kind of proof you were trained to look for. Florence Scovel Shinn consistently pointed toward this same reversal. Before circumstances change, our relationship with those circumstances often changes first. Which means the silence you've been so afraid of was never empty. It was maturing, the way fruit ripens on a branch you're not standing under, doing all of its most important work exactly while no one is watching. There is a real difference between lack of evidence and evidence you haven't learned to recognize yet. Lack of evidence would mean nothing is happening. Evidence you haven't learned to recognize means something is happening in a form you weren't taught to notice. A steadier response to a bill. A held breath released instead of a message sent too fast. A version of you who can sit inside not yet, a little longer than she could a month ago. None of these look like the deposit you were told to expect. None of them arrive with a notification, but every one of them is a return, the first evidence that an account built on trust is beginning to grow. This is the part that quietly answers the fear underneath the entire video. The fear was never really about the money, or the door, or the season taking too long. The fear was that stillness meant you'd been forgotten. You were not forgotten. You were simply looking for the wrong kind of proof in the wrong place on the wrong timeline. You were being invited to trust before you were given proof. And the whole time, the truest evidence was already collecting right where you'd stopped thinking to look. There is a question you have likely asked, in one form or another, more times than you could count. When is this finally going to happen? It's not a foolish question. It comes from somewhere sincere, a place that has waited and hoped, and occasionally wondered if hoping was even worth the risk anymore. But it is, quietly, the same question that opens every account we've talked about today, because underneath, when will this happen, is almost always its older, more anxious sibling. And what do I need to do to make it happen faster? Right now, we're going to trade that question for a different one. Not instead of caring about the outcome, simply instead of measuring your peace by it. The new question is this: who am I becoming while this is arriving? It changes everything because it moves the entire center of your waiting. You are no longer a person standing at a window keeping score of a future that hasn't shown up yet. You are a person making deposits day by day into an account that grows whether or not today happens to be the day something visible occurs. That shift alone is worth sitting with. The old question could only ever be answered by circumstances outside your control. The new one can be answered every single day by you, regardless of what the calendar decides to do. You don't need to spend your future trying to repair every moment impatience interrupted. What you need is simpler and far more available. Stop financing the version of you that impatience built, one hurried decision at a time, and let a steadier one keep making deposits instead. If something in today's conversation has already started to shift that for you, this channel exists to keep having conversations like this one. Subscribing is simply a quiet way of making sure this room is still here, the next time waiting starts to feel loud again. At the beginning of today's video, we asked what it was actually costing you to rush the things that hadn't yet arrived. Now you know, it was never the door, or the season, or the amount on a page. Those were only ever the visible charges, the ones easy to point to, easy to regret, easy to mistake for the whole story. The real account was always you. Every hurried decision was a withdrawal from the person you were becoming, and every unhurried one from this moment forward is a deposit toward her instead. You don't have to recover what impatience may have cost you. You only have to stop financing the identity that kept paying it. That is the whole account. Finally read in full, and perhaps now you can see why impatience feels so powerful. It is rarely about time itself. It is about the fear that something important has been left unattended. That same fear is what Jesus addressed when he spoke about worry, the quiet burden of trying to carry tomorrow before it has even arrived. In another conversation on this channel, we explored the words he gave us about money worry and why releasing that burden changes more than your thoughts. It changes the way you walk through uncertainty itself. Trying to control tomorrow and trying to rush it have always been the same fear, wearing two different faces. You were told at the start of today's video that almost everything you'd been taught about waiting might be backwards. Now you know what was actually true the entire time. You were never being punished by the silence. You were being trusted with it. Stay here for just one more quiet minute before you go back to whatever is waiting for you. Close your eyes if you're somewhere that allows it. Take one slow breath in and let it out even more slowly than it came. There is nothing you need to force in this moment. Whatever you've been waiting for is not lost, not late, not slipping away while you weren't looking. It is exactly where it needs to be, in the exact season it needs to be in, and it does not require your fear to keep it moving forward. Right now, you can simply stop reaching for the ledger. Let this be the decision. Not one grand, dramatic leap, just one small, unhurried moment, the kind the whole account is built from. What is meant for me does not need to be forced. The old pattern may try to return. Some old fear may come knocking again, asking you to rush something that isn't ready. That's all right. It doesn't mean this moment didn't matter. So whenever the urge to force something starts sounding reasonable again, reach for the deposit instead. Forcing never creates what's meant for you. It only reminds you that you never had to force it in the first place.